The screaming that shattered the elegant calm of Riverside Manor on that humid Alabama night in September 1854 wasn't coming from the kitchen where enslaved hands prepared elaborate dishes for white consumption. It was coming from the dining room where the entire Thornton family and their distinguished guests writhed in agony, their bodies convulsing as 6 months of accumulated voodoo curses woven into every meal suddenly reached critical mass during what was supposed to be the social triumph of the season. Master Edmund Thornton clutched his stomach and vomited blood onto the imported Belgian linen, while his wife Constance collapsed between courses, her face contorted in agony that no physician would be able to explain or treat. As the woman who had prepared their celebratory feast stood calmly in the kitchen doorway, watching the destruction she had spent half a year orchestrating through the intimate weapon of food, cursed with supernatural forces powerful enough to rot an entire family from within. If you're ready to discover the most horrifying story of culinary voodoo revenge in American history, where a brilliant spiritual practitioner used a grand celebration dinner as the culmination of 6 months of systematic cursing that destroyed not just one family, but everyone who consumed the food she prepared with such deadly intention, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Aunt Josephine accomplished through patience, voodoo knowledge, and absolute mastery of the culinary arts will make you question everything you thought you knew about the hidden power of those who prepare our food and the terrible justice that can be delivered one cursed dish at a time. The revenge that would annihilate the Thornton family and shock Alabama's planter aristocracy had been building for 50 years in the heart and mind of a woman whose knowledge of Louisiana voodoo had been acquired directly from Marie Laveau herself during years spent in New Orleans, whose culinary genius had made her the most sought-after cook in the Alabama Black Belt, and whose patience had allowed her to wait for exactly the right moment, a grand celebration dinner with the entire family and their most important social connections assembled to unleash the full devastating power of 6 months of accumulated cursing in a single apocalyptic feast. Aunt Josephine, 68 years old and the most skilled practitioner of both cooking and conjure in central Alabama, had spent half a year weaving supernatural destruction into every meal she served the Thorntons, building spiritual energies that would reach their devastating climax when the family gathered for their most elaborate dinner of the year. The year was 1854, and Alabama's Black Belt region had become one of the wealthiest areas in the American South, its dark, fertile soil yielding cotton crops that enriched plantation owners, while enslaved people worked themselves to death in conditions that combined backbreaking physical labor with systematic psychological torture designed to break human spirits. The proximity to Mobile's port had made the region a hub of cotton export and slave importation, where human beings were bought and sold with casual efficiency, while their purchasers congratulated themselves on bringing civilization to what they viewed as an inherently inferior race. Riverside Manor sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime cotton land along the Alabama River, its boundaries marked by pecan trees, whose shade had witnessed 4 generations of systematic human exploitation disguised as agricultural progress. The plantation house, an imposing Greek Revival mansion with massive Doric columns and elaborate wrought iron galleries, rose from this landscape like a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering, its architectural grandeur serving as visible proof that enormous fortunes could be built upon the systematic destruction of human lives legally defined as property. The Thornton family, Master Edmund Thornton, 56 years old and 4th-generation owner of Riverside Manor, his wife Constance, 52 and the plantation's imperious mistress, their 4 adult children ranging in age from 24 to 33, and Edmund's elderly mother Martha, who had been the plantation's previous mistress, represented the pinnacle of Alabama's cotton aristocracy. They were known throughout the Black Belt and as far away as Mobile for their refined tastes, their elaborate entertaining, and most significantly, for having the finest table in Alabama thanks to Aunt Josephine's legendary culinary abilities. Aunt Josephine had been born in New Orleans in 1786 to a mother who had been among the city's most powerful voodoo practitioners, inheriting comprehensive knowledge of spiritual traditions that combined West African religions with Catholic imagery, Haitian revolutionary mysticism, and techniques developed specifically for conditions of enslavement in the Americas. From her earliest memories, Josephine had been trained in the most dangerous aspects of conjure work, how to call upon Eloah spirits, who governed life and death, how to prepare gree-gree bags that could protect or destroy depending on their composition, how to craft curses that could kill slowly or quickly depending on the practitioner's intention, and most crucially for her ultimate revenge, how to infuse food with spiritual energies that could transform nourishment into systematic destruction. The spiritual education that had prepared Aunt Josephine to orchestrate the most devastating voodoo feast in Southern history had encompassed decades of study under Marie Laveau herself, the legendary New Orleans voodoo queen who had recognized in young Josephine the qualities needed to master the most complex and dangerous aspects of spiritual practice. During the years Josephine had spent in New Orleans before being sold to an Alabama slave trader, Marie Laveau had taught her that food cursing represented the ultimate expression of voodoo art because it combined technical mastery with sustained patience, because it exploited the most intimate connection between people, and because it could produce effects that accumulated over time in ways that made them both devastating and impossible to detect until the damage was irreversible. The technique of cursing through food that Josephine had perfected over 6 decades involved far more than simply adding toxic substances to meals. It required understanding how to weave spiritual energies into every aspect of food preparation, how to call upon specific loa who governed sickness and death, how to time cursing according to moon phases and spiritual calendars that amplified supernatural forces, and how to maintain the sustained intention over months that allowed curses to accumulate to critical mass. Marie Laveau had taught Josephine that the most powerful food curses were the ones that worked slowly and systematically, building spiritual poison in victims' bodies meal by meal until a final triggering event, a particularly elaborate feast prepared with maximum spiritual focus, would cause all the accumulated energies to activate simultaneously in a cascade of destruction that no earthly medicine could prevent or treat. Josephine's journey from New Orleans to Riverside Manor had occurred in 1812, when she had been purchased at a mobile slave market by Edmund Thornton's grandfather, specifically because of her reputation as an extraordinary cook whose skills had been developed in one of New Orleans's finest Creole households and whose knowledge of both cuisine and conjure had made her legendary throughout Louisiana. The 42 years that followed had been marked by the same peculiar contradiction that characterized the lives of many skilled enslaved cooks. Josephine had been valued for her abilities and given resources and authority unusual for someone legally defined as property, but this practical recognition of her skills had never translated into acknowledgement of her basic humanity or respect for the extraordinary knowledge she possessed. The systematic cruelty that the Thornton family had inflicted upon Josephine over 4 decades had been subtle and psychological, rather than involving the kind of physical brutality that characterized field labor, but it had been devastating nonetheless in its casual denial of her humanity and its assumption that her genius was simply natural capacity rather than acquired expertise developed through decades of study and practice. Constance Thornton in particular had developed a pattern of behavior toward Josephine that combined complete dependence on her culinary abilities with absolute refusal to acknowledge her as a person deserving of basic dignity or gratitude. The specific incident that had finally transformed Josephine from patient survivor into active agent of supernatural destruction had occurred 6 months earlier, when Constance had announced plans for the most elaborate dinner party in Riverside Manor's history, a celebration of the Thornton family's 50th anniversary of continuous ownership of the plantation, to be attended by Alabama's governor, prominent planters from across the Black Belt, and distinguished visitors from Mobile and Montgomery. During the planning discussions, Constance had explained to her assembled white friends that the dinner would showcase what these people can accomplish when properly directed. My cook produces the most wonderful dishes through some kind of instinctive capacity, the way a bird builds nests without being taught, demonstrating that enslaved Negroes have certain natural abilities that emerge without requiring actual intelligence or education. The laughter that had greeted Constance's casual dehumanization, combined with 42 years of accumulated insults and systematic denial of Josephine's extraordinary knowledge and skills, had crystallized the elderly cook's determination to use the planned celebration as the culminating moment of a revenge campaign that would prove conclusively who possessed real power in the intimate space of the kitchen. Josephine had smiled and nodded when Constance outlined her expectations for the dinner, while privately beginning to plan the most comprehensive voodoo cursing campaign of her long career. 6 months of systematic spiritual destruction woven into every meal the family consumed, building to a climactic feast where all the accumulated energies would activate simultaneously and destroy everyone who consumed food from her cursed kitchen. The planning that had gone into Josephine's campaign of culinary destruction had been meticulous and sophisticated, drawing upon 6 decades of accumulated voodoo knowledge while exploiting her intimate understanding of the Thornton family's tastes, eating habits, and the complete trust they placed in food she prepared. The curse she crafted was designed to operate in 2 phases, a preparatory period where she would build spiritual energies in the family's bodies through daily cursed meals, and a culminating activation during the grand celebration dinner when those accumulated energies would reach critical mass and produce simultaneous catastrophic effects in everyone who had consumed her cooking over the preceding months. The spiritual architecture of Josephine's curse involved calling upon the most powerful and dangerous Loa in the voodoo pantheon. Baron Samedi, who ruled over death in the graveyard, was invoked to ensure that the curse would be ultimately fatal. Erzuli Dantor, the fierce protector of women who had been wronged, was called upon to channel righteous rage into the working. Legba, who controlled crossroads and thresholds, including the boundary between nourishment and poison, was petitioned to transform the act of eating from sustenance into destruction. And most crucially, the collective spirits of all the enslaved people who had died at Riverside Manor over 4 generations were invited to participate in the annihilation of the family that had profited from their suffering. The physical components of the curse had been gathered over months of careful preparation during the dark moon when such work was most powerful. Graveyard dirt from the unmarked burial ground where enslaved people who died at Riverside Manor were interred without recognition or ceremony to connect the curse to accumulated ancestral rage spanning generations. River water drawn from the spot where an enslaved woman had drowned herself and her children rather than see them sold away, to channel the desperation and fury of maternal love destroyed by slavery. Herbs and roots that promoted decay and systemic failure in living tissue, prepared according to precise voodoo formulas that activated their spiritual rather than merely chemical properties. And most powerfully, Josephine's own blood, hair, and nail clippings to bind the curse to her personal power and ensure that 6 decades of accumulated spiritual knowledge would fuel its devastating effects. The methodology that Josephine employed during the 6-month preparatory phase involved infusing every meal she prepared for the Thornton family with carefully measured amounts of cursed materials and spiritual energies, weaving supernatural destruction into their food with the same precision and attention to detail that had made her famous throughout Alabama for her culinary excellence. Each meal became a ritual, each dish an offering to the Loa. Each bite, the family consumed another increment of spiritual poison, accumulating in their bodies and waiting for the moment when Josephine would speak the activation prayers during the grand celebration dinner. The genius of Josephine's approach lay in her understanding that the curse needed to work invisibly during the preparatory phase, producing no obvious symptoms that might alert the family or their physicians to what was happening, while building spiritual energies that would become devastating once activated during the climactic feast. She calibrated her daily cursing to remain below the threshold of detection, adding just enough spiritual poison to each meal to contribute to the accumulation without producing immediate effects, creating a situation where the family would unknowingly participate in their own destruction through the simple act of eating food they trusted and enjoyed. The first subtle signs of the curse's preparatory work had appeared as minor ailments that the family dismissed as inconsequential. Occasional indigestion that Constance attributed to rich food, mild fatigue that Edmund blamed on the Alabama heat, a general sense of malaise among the adult children that they explained away as the natural result of plantation management responsibilities. But what they didn't understand was that these minor symptoms represented the spiritual foundation being laid for the catastrophic effects that would manifest during the celebration dinner, building blocks of supernatural destruction that were accumulating in their bodies with every meal they consumed from Josephine's cursed kitchen. The physicians who occasionally examined the Thornton family during those 6 months found nothing alarming. The symptoms were too vague and intermittent to suggest serious illness, and the family's general health appeared adequate, if not robust. Dr. Samuel Winters, the plantation's regular physician, attributed the minor complaints to the stress of preparing for such an elaborate social event. never imagining that he was witnessing the preliminary effects of a voodoo curse so sophisticated that it would remain essentially invisible until the moment Josephine chose to activate its full, devastating power. The preparation of the celebration dinner itself had begun 3 weeks before the scheduled event, as Josephine worked with an intensity and focus that surpassed even her legendary standards of excellence. She selected ingredients with supernatural as well as culinary considerations, choosing foods whose spiritual properties would amplify the curse's effects. She prepared cursed materials in quantities far exceeding anything she had used during the preparatory phase, understanding that the activation feast needed to carry enough spiritual energy to trigger all the poison that had been accumulating in the family's bodies for 6 months. The menu that Josephine designed for the celebration dinner was a masterpiece of both culinary art and supernatural warfare. 12 elaborate courses ranging from delicate appetizers to rich desserts, each dish a perfect expression of her technical mastery, and each one saturated with voodoo energies, calibrated to produce specific destructive effects when consumed. She planned to begin with oysters prepared with graveyard dirt, worked into the accompanying sauce, progress through multiple meat and vegetable courses infused with river water and cursed herbs, and culminate with desserts that would carry the final activation prayers spoken over sugar, transformed from sweetness into spiritual poison. The day of the celebration dinner arrived with typical September heat and humidity, the Alabama sun turning Riverside Manor's grounds into a furnace, while inside the house enslaved people worked frantically to prepare for the evening's festivities. The dining room had been decorated with elaborate floral arrangements, and the table set with the finest china, crystal, and silver that 4 generations of cotton prophets had accumulated. The guest list included 32 of Alabama's most prominent citizens, the governor and his wife, wealthy planters and their families, merchants from Mobile, and various social luminaries whose presence would confirm the Thornton family's position at the apex of Black Belt society. As evening approached and guests began arriving in their carriages, Josephine stood in her kitchen surrounded by the dishes she had spent 3 weeks preparing, speaking the final prayers in Creole French that would activate 6 months of accumulated cursing and transform the celebration feast into an apocalyptic demonstration of voodoo power. She called upon Baron Samedi to claim the souls of those who had profited from death, upon Erzuli Dantor to channel the rage of all wronged women into devastating vengeance, upon Legba to ensure that every threshold the cursed food crossed would amplify its destructive power, and upon the countless enslaved spirits who had died at Riverside Manor to participate in the annihilation of the family that had treated them as property. The stage was set for the most devastating voodoo feast in Southern history. As dozens of elegantly dressed guests gathered in Riverside Manor's dining room, completely unaware that every beautiful dish about to be served had been transformed into a vehicle for supernatural destruction, and that the trusted cook whose genius had made this dinner possible had spent 6 months weaving their deaths into the food they were about to consume with such appreciation and pleasure. The voodoo education that had prepared Aunt Josephine to orchestrate the most devastating supernatural feast in Southern history had begun in the cramped back room of a New Orleans building on St. Anne Street in 1791, where Marie Laveau, already recognized as the most powerful voodoo practitioner in Louisiana, despite being only 10 years older than her student, had identified in 5-year-old Josephine the rare combination of spiritual sensitivity, intellectual capacity, and moral clarity needed to master the most dangerous aspects of conjure work, including the ability to transform food from nourishment into systematic destruction. Under the protection of darkness and Catholic imagery that concealed African spirits from white authorities, Marie Laveau had taught young Josephine that true power came not from dramatic confrontation, but from patient exploitation of intimacy and trust, that the most effective revenge operated through daily routines rather than sudden violence, and that those who controlled what people ate controlled life and death in ways that slaveholders could never fully comprehend or prevent. The foundation of Josephine's training in food cursing had involved understanding the profound spiritual significance of eating as the most vulnerable moment in human existence, the act of taking something from outside the body and incorporating it into one's physical being, trusting that what crossed the threshold between external world and internal self would sustain rather than destroy. Marie Laveau had taught Josephine that this trust created perfect opportunities for spiritual warfare, because people's psychological defenses were completely lowered when they ate food prepared by someone they believed was loyal, or at least controlled, their bodies were open to receive whatever energies had been woven into their meals, and the repetitive nature of daily eating allowed curses to accumulate in ways that produced devastating effects over time, while remaining essentially invisible until the moment the practitioner chose to activate their full destructive power. The specific techniques that Josephine had mastered during her years studying under Marie Laveau's direct guidance had encompassed both the spiritual and practical dimensions of culinary cursing at levels of sophistication that exceeded anything practiced by ordinary conjure workers. On the spiritual level, she had learned to call upon specific Loa, who governed different aspects of sickness, death, and the transformation of blessing into curse, not just invoking them generally, but establishing ongoing relationships with these spiritual entities that allowed her to request their assistance with the same confidence that a master craftsman might call upon reliable apprentices. On the practical level, she had learned to identify and prepare materials that could carry spiritual energies into food without being detected by taste, smell, or appearance, to time her cursing according to complex spiritual calendars that took into account moon phases, planetary positions, and the feast days of various Loa, and most crucially, to maintain the sustained intention and focus over months or years that systematic food cursing required to achieve maximum devastating effect. The methodology of advanced food cursing that Marie Laveau had taught Josephine involved transforming the entire process of cooking into an extended ritual, where every action from selecting ingredients to presenting finished dishes became part of a comprehensive spiritual working. Josephine had learned to begin each cursing session by creating sacred space in her kitchen through prayers and offerings to the Loa, establishing spiritual conditions that would amplify the power of whatever work she conducted. She would prepare her cursed materials, graveyard dirt, river water, specially treated herbs, while maintaining intense visualization of her intention that these substances would sicken and ultimately destroy those who consumed them. Speaking prayers in Creole French that bound supernatural forces to her will and directed them toward specific targets with surgical precision. The actual incorporation of cursed materials into food required extraordinary technical skill that went far beyond simple poisoning, as the amounts used had to be sufficient to carry spiritual energies while remaining completely undetectable to victims' senses and to any chemical analysis that might be performed if suspicions arose. A few grains of graveyard dirt worked into flour with such precision that it affected neither taste nor texture, but carried the spiritual signature of death into every bite of bread. River water used to thin sauces or cook vegetables, diluted to invisibility, but concentrated enough spiritually to channel the accumulated rage of generations of suffering. Herbs prepared according to voodoo formulas that activated their supernatural, rather than merely chemical properties, incorporated into dishes with such culinary mastery that they enhanced rather than detracted from flavor, while simultaneously carrying deadly spiritual energies into everything they touched. But the most sophisticated aspect of Josephine's food cursing technique involved what Marie Laveau had called layered intention, the practice of weaving multiple levels of spiritual energy into the same dish so that it would produce different effects depending on timing and activation. During the preparatory phase of a curse, Josephine would incorporate energies that remained dormant and essentially harmless, building spiritual poison in victims' bodies, meal by meal without producing symptoms that might alert them to danger. Then, during a final activation meal prepared with maximum spiritual focus, she would add prayers and materials that would trigger all the accumulated energies simultaneously, producing catastrophic effects that seemed to emerge from nowhere, but which actually represented months of patient supernatural work, finally reaching critical mass. The Thornton family's transformation into Josephine's victims, rather than her owners, had its roots in 42 years of accumulated cruelty that combined everyday indignities with periodic incidents of such profound disrespect that they had burned themselves into Josephine's memory with the permanence of brands. Edmund Thornton's grandfather had purchased her from a Mobile slave market in 1812, specifically because of her New Orleans reputation, treating the transaction as acquiring a particularly valuable piece of equipment, rather than purchasing a human being whose knowledge of both cuisine and conjure exceeded anything the Thorntons could comprehend, despite their university educations and social refinement. The 4 decades that followed, had been marked by the same fundamental contradiction that characterized the lives of many extraordinarily skilled enslaved people. Josephine had been given resources and authority within her kitchen domain that were unusual for someone legally defined as property, but this practical recognition of her abilities had never translated into acknowledgement of her basic humanity or respect for the decades of study and practice that had produced her mastery. The Thorntons had depended on Josephine completely for their social reputation and their daily sustenance, yet they had simultaneously treated her as property whose value lay entirely in her utility to them rather than in any inherent human worth. Constance Thornton's particular form of cruelty toward Josephine over the years had been characterized by systematic denial of her intelligence and expertise through casual comments that presented her culinary genius as instinctive capacity rather than acquired knowledge. The mistress had developed a habit of explaining to dinner guests that these people have natural abilities for certain tasks, the way animals have instincts. There's no real thought or understanding involved, just primitive capacity that emerges without education or intelligence. The contradiction between these claims and the extraordinary sophistication of the meals Josephine produced had been obvious to anyone capable of recognizing it. But white Southern society had been so invested in beliefs about black inferiority that they had managed to simultaneously enjoy her genius while denying it existed. The specific humiliations that Constance had inflicted over the decades had included presenting Josephine to guests as living proof of her theories about enslaved people's supposed limitations, while serving meals that demonstrated technical mastery and creative sophistication that would have been remarkable coming from any chef, regardless of race or legal status. During one particularly memorable dinner party, Constance had brought guests into the kitchen to observe Josephine working and had explained that you can see how she operates entirely by instinct and repetition. There's no actual comprehension of the chemical and physical principles involved in cooking, just learned behaviors performed without real understanding, rather like a performing animal executing tricks it has been trained to do. The incident that had finally pushed Josephine from patient endurance into active supernatural warfare had been the announcement 6 months earlier of the grand celebration dinner and Constance's accompanying explanation that the event would demonstrate what these people can accomplish when properly directed. The laughter that had greeted this casual dehumanization, laughter from white women who had been enjoying Josephine's culinary artistry for decades, had been the final straw, crystallizing 42 years of accumulated rage into determination to use the planned celebration as the culminating moment of a revenge campaign that would prove conclusively that the primitive cook possessed powers and knowledge that her civilized owners couldn't begin to imagine. The planning phase of Josephine's revenge had involved careful consideration of timing, methodology, and the specific effects she wanted to produce during the activation feast. She had decided immediately that the grand celebration dinner itself would serve as the climactic moment, not only because it would allow her to demonstrate her power in front of Alabama's elite, but because the symbolic significance of transforming a celebration of the Thornton family's success into the occasion of their destruction would be perfect poetic justice. The 50-year anniversary of continuous Thornton ownership of Riverside Manor would become the anniversary of their annihilation through the supernatural power of someone they had owned but never truly controlled. The collection of cursed materials had required months of preparation conducted with absolute secrecy, as Josephine had needed to gather components from various sources without arousing suspicion from the household or from other enslaved people who might inadvertently reveal her activities. The graveyard dirt had come from the unmarked burial ground, where generations of enslaved people who died at Riverside Manor had been interred without ceremony or recognition, collected during midnight visits, when Josephine had slipped away from her quarters to commune with spirits of the dead and request their participation in the coming destruction. The river water that formed another crucial component of her cursing had been drawn from a specific location that held particular spiritual significance, the spot where 10 years earlier an enslaved woman named Sarah had drowned herself and her 2 small children rather than see them sold away to different plantations. Josephine had known Sarah well and had witnessed her desperation as the sale approached, had held her hand and tried to offer comfort that proved inadequate against the horror of permanent separation. The water drawn from that location carried not just physical substance, but the spiritual residue of Sarah's final act of maternal love expressed through mutual death. And Josephine understood that incorporating this water into the Thornton family's food would channel that desperate maternal fury into supernatural destruction of people who had treated children as property to be bought and sold without regard for human bonds. The herbs and roots that formed the physical basis of Josephine's cursing had been gathered from woods and swamps surrounding Riverside Manor, plants that Voodoo tradition recognized as having properties that promoted decay, systemic failure, and the transformation of healthy tissue into diseased matter. But these materials had required extensive ritual preparation to activate their spiritual rather than merely chemical properties. They had been soaked in menstrual blood to connect them to feminine power and the mysteries of life and death, buried for 9 days to infuse them with earth energy and the power of things that dwell beneath the surface, and blessed by the lower during private ceremonies Josephine conducted in her quarters, using altars concealed behind ordinary household items that white observers would never recognize as having spiritual significance. The methodology that Josephine employed during the 6-month preparatory phase involved varying the specific spiritual energies she incorporated into each meal based on careful observation of family members' individual vulnerabilities and the need to build cursed materials in their bodies without producing symptoms that might alert physicians to unusual conditions. Edmund, as family patriarch and ultimate owner of everyone at Riverside Manor, received curses specifically designed to attack masculine authority and physical vitality. Constance, as the primary target whose casual cruelty had triggered Josephine's revenge, received the heaviest ongoing doses of cursed materials and the most intense spiritual focus. The adult children received graduated cursing calibrated to their individual complicity in family sins. And Edmund's elderly mother, Martha, who had been the plantation's previous mistress and who had set the tone for the casual dehumanization that Constance had perpetuated, received curses designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that came with advanced age. The progression of subtle symptoms during the 6-month preparatory phase had followed patterns that Josephine had designed to remain below the threshold of medical concern, while confirming that her cursing was taking root in the family's bodies. Edmund began experiencing occasional digestive discomfort that he attributed to rich food and stress. Constance developed mild but persistent fatigue that seemed to resist all attempts at rest or recuperation. The adult children complained of vague malaise and a general sense of being slightly unwell without any specific ailment that could be identified or treated. Martha, already declining from age, experienced what appeared to be normal progression of elderly frailty without any obvious acceleration that might suggest supernatural causes. The physical mechanisms through which the preparatory curse operated involve both actual accumulation of toxic materials in the family's bodies and spiritual energies that affected their vitality at levels deeper than mere physiology. The graveyard dirt and river water carried both literal pathogens and spiritual signatures of death and desperation that worked together to weaken those who consumed them. The herbs and roots promoted actual physical changes at cellular levels, while also serving as vehicles for supernatural forces that attacked the family's life force in ways that 19th century medicine had no tools to detect or comprehend. But the most crucial aspect of Josephine's preparatory cursing was the way it created spiritual foundations that would allow the activation feast to produce devastating effects far beyond what any single meal could normally accomplish. Each cursed meal over 6 months added another layer of supernatural poison to the family's bodies, building structures of spiritual energy that would remain dormant and essentially harmless until Josephine spoke the activation prayers during the celebration dinner. The accumulated cursing represented potential energy waiting to be triggered, spiritual bombs planted inside the family's bodies that would detonate simultaneously when Josephine provided the supernatural spark during the climactic feast. The medical consultations that occurred during the 6 months as family members sought explanation for their vague but persistent symptoms, revealed the complete inability of contemporary medicine to recognize or address conditions caused by voodoo cursing. Dr. Winters examined the family repeatedly and found nothing alarming. Their symptoms were too non-specific and intermittent to suggest serious disease, and conventional treatments like bloodletting and purgatives seemed to provide temporary relief, even though they had no effect on the underlying supernatural causes. The physician attributed the family's complaints to stress, climate, and the natural decline that came with aging, never imagining that he was witnessing the preliminary effects of the most sophisticated voodoo curse ever deployed in Alabama. The psychological state of the Thornton family during those 6 months had been characterized by increasing anxiety about their health, combined with excitement about the upcoming celebration that would demonstrate their social prominence to Alabama's elite. The contradiction between feeling vaguely unwell and needing to appear robust and successful for their grand dinner created stress that actually amplified the curse's effects. As Josephine had known it would, worry and anxiety weakened the body's natural defenses and made people more vulnerable to both physical illness and spiritual attack, creating ideal conditions for the cursing to take deep root. The preparation of the celebration dinner itself during the 3 weeks before the event had represented the culmination of Josephine's 6 decades of accumulated knowledge and her 42 years of patient suffering at Riverside Manor. She had worked with an intensity and focus that exceeded even her legendary standards, selecting ingredients with both culinary and supernatural considerations in mind, preparing cursed materials in quantities far exceeding anything used during the preparatory phase, and maintaining constant prayer and visualization that would ensure the activation feast would trigger all the spiritual poison that had been accumulating in the family's bodies for half a year. If this incredible story of systematic revenge through voodoo feast preparation has you completely captivated and desperate to know how Aunt Josephine's 6 months of cursing reaches its devastating climax during the grand celebration dinner, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of culinary justice delivered through supernatural mastery. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most shocking true stories where patient planning and spiritual knowledge succeeded, where immediate rebellion would have failed. Drop a comment below, telling me where you're watching from and whether you'd trust food prepared by someone you'd systematically wronged for decades. I love hearing from viewers around the world who engage with these questions about the vulnerability we all experience when we trust others with what we eat. The stage was set for the apocalyptic activation of 6 months of accumulated cursing, as Alabama's elite gathered in Riverside Manor's dining room, completely unaware that the beautiful feast about to be served represented the most devastating demonstration of voodoo power in Southern history. The activation of 6 months of accumulated voodoo cursing began with the first course of Riverside Manor's grand celebration dinner, as Aunt Josephine's meticulously prepared oysters were served to 32 of Alabama's most prominent citizens, who had no idea that the delicate seafood they were consuming with such appreciation had been transformed into vehicles for supernatural destruction through prayers spoken in Creole French and graveyard dirt worked into the accompanying mignonette sauce with such precision that it affected neither taste nor appearance while carrying his spiritual signature of death into every elegant bite. The governor of Alabama raised his glass in a toast to the Thornton family's 50 years of success while unknowingly consuming the first increment of the curse that would kill him before midnight. And Constance Thornton smiled with satisfaction at the social triumph unfolding in her dining room, completely unaware that she had perhaps 2 hours left to live before the accumulated spiritual poison in her body reached critical mass and began the systematic destruction of every vital organ simultaneously. The progression of the feast through its 12 elaborate courses represented both culinary masterpiece and supernatural countdown. As each dish Josephine sent from her kitchen carried increasingly concentrated doses of cursed materials and spiritual energies designed to build toward the climactic dessert course, where she would speak the final activation prayers that would trigger all the accumulated cursing simultaneously. The second course, a delicate consommé prepared with river water drawn from the spot where Sarah had drowned herself and her children, went down smoothly while depositing another layer of spiritual poison. The third course, roasted quail stuffed with herbs prepared according to voodoo formulas, was praised enthusiastically while adding its contribution to the supernatural bombs being assembled inside each diner's body. The conversation at the dinner table during the early courses had been animated and self-congratulatory, as Alabama's planter aristocracy celebrated their own success and discussed politics, cotton prices, and the latest news from Washington about sectional tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. Edmund Thornton held forth on plantation management techniques while consuming the fourth course, fish prepared with butter infused with cursed materials, completely unaware that his voice would fail within hours as his body began its catastrophic decline. Constance entertained the ladies with stories about managing enslaved house servants while eating the fifth course, vegetables cooked in water that carried the spiritual residue of generations of suffering, never imagining that she was literally consuming the vengeance of people she had treated as property for decades. But it was during the sixth course, an elaborate roast prepared as the dinner's centerpiece, that the first subtle signs of the curse's activation began to manifest among the diners. The governor experienced a sudden wave of nausea that he initially dismissed as having eaten too quickly, not understanding that he was feeling the preliminary effects of 6 months of accumulated spiritual poison beginning to activate in his digestive system. One of the planter's wives felt a strange tightness in her chest that she attributed to her corset being laced too tightly, unaware that she was experiencing the curse's first assault on her cardiovascular system. Several guests commented on feeling unusually warm, despite the evening breeze coming through the open windows, their bodies beginning to respond to supernatural forces that were raising their core temperatures as part of the systematic destruction that Josephine had designed. Josephine herself stood in the kitchen doorway between courses, watching the dining room with an expression of calm satisfaction as she observed the early symptoms beginning to appear among guests who remained completely oblivious to the true nature of what was happening to them. She had timed her cursing with precision, developed over 6 decades of voodoo practice, understanding exactly how long the accumulated spiritual poison would take to reach activation threshold once she began serving the feast she had prepared with such deadly intention. The next 3 courses would continue building toward critical mass, and then the dessert would provide the final trigger that would transform vague discomfort into catastrophic systemic failure, affecting every person who had consumed food from her cursed kitchen. The 7th course brought increased symptoms that guests were beginning to find difficult to dismiss as simple overindulgence, as the governor excused himself briefly, his face pale and sweating, while returning to the table, insisting he was fine despite obvious distress. The 8th course saw one of the younger Thornton children, Edmund Jr., aged 28, suddenly clutch his stomach and double over with pain so intense that conversation at the table momentarily stopped, before he insisted it was merely a cramp that would pass. The 9th course witnessed Constance Thornton experiencing her first bout of the violent nausea that would soon become uncontrollable, though she managed to maintain her composure and continue playing the gracious hostess even as her body began rebelling against 6 months of accumulated cursing, finally reaching the threshold where supernatural destruction could no longer be suppressed. The 10th course marked the point where the curse's activation could no longer be mistaken for ordinary illness, as multiple guests simultaneously experienced severe symptoms that created genuine alarm among the assembled company. The governor's wife collapsed in her chair, gasping for breath and clutching at her throat as if being strangled by invisible hands. 2 of the prominent planters pushed back from the table and vomited onto the imported Belgian linen, their bodies desperately trying to purge what had already been absorbed into their systems over the course of the evening. Edmund Thornton's elderly mother, Martha, slumped sideways, unconscious before anyone could reach her, her aged body unable to withstand even the preliminary assault of forces that would soon overwhelm much younger and healthier victims. The panic that erupted in Riverside Manor's dining room exceeded anything that polite Southern society was prepared to handle. As Alabama's elite found themselves simultaneously stricken with symptoms so severe and uniform that even those still capable of rational thought understood they were dealing with something beyond ordinary food poisoning. Edmund Thornton, himself experiencing excruciating stomach pains and difficulty breathing, managed to shout for someone to fetch doctors while demanding that all enslaved people in the house be assembled immediately to determine what had happened to the food. Constance, vomiting blood onto her silk gown, could only point weakly toward the kitchen before collapsing completely. The scene that greeted the first person who burst into the kitchen seeking Josephine would be remembered and recounted for generations. The elderly cook standing calmly beside the final 2 courses that had not yet been served, surrounded by the implements of her craft and the spiritual paraphernalia she had deliberately left visible now that concealment was no longer necessary. On the table beside the prepared desserts sat a small altar featuring Catholic saints' images that any voodoo practitioner would recognize as representing lower spirits, surrounded by candles, offerings, and the gris-gris bags that had contained her cursed materials. Josephine made no attempt to flee or hide what she had done, understanding that this moment of revelation was as much a part of her revenge as the physical destruction occurring in the dining room. "What have you done?" the horrified overseer demanded when he found Josephine standing amid evidence of voodoo practice that confirmed every paranoid fear that white slaveholders harbored about African spiritual traditions they couldn't understand or control. "What did you put in the food? What's happening to them?" The response that Josephine delivered in that moment encompassed not just this specific act of revenge, but 42 years of accumulated knowledge, suffering, and determination to prove that those who were owned possessed powers their owners could never fully comprehend. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had already won every battle that mattered, and who could afford to be completely honest about what she had accomplished and why. "I put justice in the food," Josephine said calmly in her Creole-accented English. 6 months of justice, worked into every meal they ate, blessed by the lower, and carried by the spirits of every enslaved person who died on this plantation. I put graveyard dirt to bring them death, river water to carry their souls away, and herbs prepared according to knowledge Marie Laveau herself taught me 60 years ago. I put in 42 years of being treated as property, despite being the most skilled practitioner of both cooking and conjure in Alabama. And tonight, in that feast they're dying from right now, I put the final activation that makes all those months of cursing reach critical mass at the same moment. The confession that followed as Josephine was seized and dragged toward the dining room exceeded anything the desperate Thorntons and their guests had imagined, even after witnessing the voodoo altar in the kitchen. The elderly cook explained in precise clinical detail exactly what she had been doing to their food for 6 months, describing the graveyard dirt worked into their daily bread, the river water incorporated into their soups and sauces, the herbs prepared according to voodoo formulas and added to every dish. She described the prayers she had spoken over their meals, the lower spirits she had called upon to transform nourishment into poison, and the sustained spiritual work she had conducted to ensure that 6 months of accumulated cursing would activate simultaneously during their celebration feast. "Every bite you took," Josephine told the assembled company with devastating calm, "every meal you enjoyed, every dish you praised, all of it carried spiritual forces dedicated to your destruction. Baron Samedi heard my prayers and transformed your daily bread into daily death. Holy Dantor channeled 42 years of righteous rage into energies that entered your bodies with every meal, and the spirits of generations of enslaved people participated in your annihilation through the graveyard dirt you consumed without knowing for 6 months. The medical emergency that unfolded as symptoms continued to intensify revealed the complete helplessness of 19th century medicine to address conditions caused by voodoo cursing that had been building in victims' bodies for months before activation. Dr. Winters arrived to find more than 30 people in various stages of acute distress, experiencing symptoms that ranged from violent vomiting and convulsions to complete circulatory collapse and apparent organ failure. The physician's attempts to provide treatment, inducing further vomiting, administering activated charcoal, bloodletting to remove supposed toxins, proved not merely ineffective but actually harmful, as they weakened bodies that were already under supernatural assault they had no natural defenses against. The interrogation that Edmund Thornton managed to conduct, despite his own rapidly failing condition, focused desperately on whether there was any antidote or counter-curse that could reverse the effects of what Josephine had done. The plantation owner, clutching his stomach and struggling to breathe, demanded to know if the curse could be undone, if the spiritual poison could be purged from their bodies, if there was any way to prevent what seemed to be inevitable death approaching rapidly for everyone who had consumed the feast. Josephine's response delivered the terrible truth that the assembled company didn't want to hear, but which represented the reality of sophisticated voodoo cursing, properly executed according to knowledge, passed down through generations of African spiritual practitioners. "There is no antidote," she said with the finality of someone pronouncing judgment. "The curse has been building in your bodies for 6 months. Tonight's feast activated all that accumulated poison simultaneously. It's already in your blood, in your organs, in every tissue. The lower have claimed you. No earthly medicine can undo what spiritual forces have accomplished." The theological crisis that several of the dying guests experienced in their final hours revealed the inadequacy of Christian beliefs to provide comfort or explanation for what was happening to them. The governor, a devout Methodist who had built his political career partly on appeals to religious voters, called for a minister to come and pray for divine intervention, but the prayers felt hollow in the face of forces that operated according to rules that Protestant theology had no framework to address. The minister's assurances that God would protect the righteous rang false when the righteous were clearly dying from spiritual attack, while their enslaved tormentor stood before them, calmly accepting whatever earthly punishment might follow. "Your God may be powerful," Josephine observed when the minister had finished his ineffective prayers, "but he doesn't seem much interested in preventing the suffering of people who built their wealth on the bodies of his children. The lower I serve understand that sometimes justice requires destruction, that some evils are so profound they can only be answered through forces that operate beyond earthly law and Christian mercy. You can pray all you want, but Baron Samedi has already claimed you, and no amount of Christian prayer will prevent him from collecting what I offered him 6 months ago." The deaths began approximately 3 hours after the feast had started, as the curse's activation reached its peak effect in victims whose bodies could no longer withstand the systematic assault on every vital system simultaneously. The governor's wife was the first to succumb, her heart simply stopping as if a switch had been thrown, despite desperate attempts at resuscitation by physicians who had no understanding of the supernatural forces that had killed her. Edmund Thornton's elderly mother, Martha, followed within minutes, her aged body offering no resistance to forces that would have overwhelmed much younger victims. Then the deaths came faster, 2 of the prominent planters within moments of each other, the governor himself gasping out his final breath, while trying to understand how a celebration of Southern aristocratic success had transformed into his own execution. The climactic moment that sealed the absolute completeness of Josephine's revenge came when Constance Thornton, still barely conscious despite massive internal hemorrhaging, looked directly at the cook who had served her family for 42 years and asked the question that had been haunting her since the truth was revealed. "Why? Why would you do this to us? We gave you a good position, better than most slaves. We valued your skills, we trusted you with our daily sustenance. Why would you betray that trust with such evil?" The response that Josephine delivered to her dying mistress encompassed not just 6 months of cursing, but 4 decades of systematic dehumanization that had finally produced the justice that earthly law would never provide. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated suffering and the satisfaction of someone who had delivered perfect vengeance against people who had never imagined that the property they owned possessed the knowledge and will to destroy them. "You valued my skills?" Josephine repeated, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to a dying child. "You told everyone I cooked through primitive instinct, like an animal performing tricks. You laughed when I served meals that demonstrated knowledge and technique you couldn't begin to replicate, then claimed I produced them without real intelligence or understanding. You depended on me for everything that made your social position possible, then treated me as property whose humanity was irrelevant to your comfort. And you ask why I would betray you. I didn't betray you. I simply used the only weapon available to someone you owned but couldn't control. I used your complete dependence on food I prepared, your trust in hands you'd never given reason to be trustworthy, and knowledge you dismissed as primitive superstition to deliver justice you couldn't prevent or survive." The final hours of that terrible night witnessed the deaths of all 4 adult Thornton children, Edmund Thornton himself, and nearly half of the distinguished guests who had come to celebrate Southern aristocratic success and instead consumed their own destruction, prepared by hands they had systematically wronged. By dawn, Riverside Manor's elegant dining room had been transformed into a charnel house where bodies lay amid the ruins of an elaborate feast, while Aunt Josephine sat calmly in the kitchen, awaiting whatever earthly punishment would follow her supernatural triumph, having proven conclusively that those who controlled what people ate controlled life and death in ways that slaveholders' wealth and power could never fully protect against. The aftermath of what became known throughout Alabama and beyond as the Voodoo Feast of Riverside Manor left 18 people dead, including the entire Thornton family, the governor of Alabama, and some of the state's most prominent planters, while 14 survivors carried physical and psychological scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, as they grappled with the knowledge that they had consumed their own destruction, prepared by hands they had trusted and had survived only through chance variations in individual constitution, rather than through any protection their wealth or social position could provide. The execution of Aunt Josephine occurred 3 days after the feast, carried out with brutal efficiency, as Alabama authorities sought to demonstrate that white power could still deliver earthly justice even when it had proven completely incapable of preventing supernatural destruction. But the hanging that was intended to restore order and discourage future resistance instead became a demonstration of Josephine's spiritual victory as she walked to the gallows speaking prayers in Creole French and died with a smile that made clear she considered her death an acceptable price for the justice she had delivered. The final words that Josephine spoke before the noose tightened around her neck would be remembered and repeated throughout enslaved communities across the South for generations, becoming part of the oral tradition that sustained resistance and provided hope that those who seemed powerless possessed resources their oppressors could neither understand nor fully control. Standing on the gallows platform in the courtyard of Riverside Manor, with the entire enslaved population forced to watch as a warning, Josephine had delivered testimony that was simultaneously confession, prophecy, and instruction to every enslaved person who might hear the story. "I die satisfied," Josephine had said in a voice that carried across the assembled crowd with supernatural clarity. "In one night I accomplished what a lifetime of submission never could have achieved. I destroyed people who thought they owned me, using knowledge they dismissed as primitive superstition and skills they claimed were instinctive rather than learned. Let this be a lesson to every master and mistress in Alabama and beyond. The people who cook your food possess power you can never fully control. You can own our bodies, but you cannot own our knowledge, cannot prevent us from using that knowledge for justice, and cannot escape the consequences of treating as property people who remember they are human beings with the capacity and the will to fight back through means you never imagined existed." The impact of Josephine's execution on Riverside Manor's enslaved population was profound and complex, as people grappled with grief at losing an extraordinary cook and spiritual leader, while simultaneously feeling deep satisfaction that she had delivered devastating justice against oppressors and had died on her own terms, rather than submitting to the kind of broken defeat that slavery was designed to produce. Ruth, a young woman who had worked in the house and who had witnessed both Josephine's daily work and the apocalyptic feast, emerged as the keeper of Josephine's story and the one who would ensure that future generations understood not just what had happened, but why it had mattered. The disposition of Riverside Manor following the deaths revealed how completely Josephine's revenge had disrupted Alabama's planter aristocracy. As the property passed to distant Thornton relatives who had no desire to live in a house where 18 people had died from voodoo cursing, and where the kitchen was viewed by enslaved people throughout the region as sacred ground, where supernatural justice had been delivered through culinary mastery. Within a year, the plantation had been sold at a loss to buyers from outside Alabama who didn't fully understand its dark history. But even new ownership couldn't erase the spiritual reputation that clung to Riverside Manor like morning fog to the Alabama River. The survivors of the Voodoo feast, 14 people who had consumed cursed food, but whose individual constitutions had allowed them to survive the systematic assault that killed their companions, spent the rest of their lives grappling with physical ailments and psychological trauma that 19th century medicine had no ability to treat or explain. Several developed chronic digestive problems that resisted all attempted treatments, their bodies seemingly unable to fully recover from the supernatural attack they had survived. Others experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to eat meals prepared by anyone else without experiencing crippling anxiety, waking from nightmares about consuming poison, and developing paranoid fixations on the safety of their food that made normal eating impossible. Dr. Winters, who had attended the victims and witnessed effects that defied every principle of medical science he had studied, published a controversial paper in the Southern Medical Journal that acknowledged the possibility that African spiritual traditions might access forms of causation that European medicine had no framework to recognize or address. The Riverside Manor incident presents a fundamental challenge to assumptions about the relationship between mind, body, and spiritual forces, Dr. Winters wrote in his analysis. 18 people died with symptoms consistent with systematic poisoning, yet every chemical test we conducted found no toxic substances in the food or in victims' bodies. The enslaved cook who was executed for the deaths claimed to have used voodoo cursing to transform nourishment into destruction. And while this explanation seems impossible according to current medical understanding, I can offer no alternative theory that better explains the observed facts and the uniform presentation of symptoms across multiple victims. The broader impact of the Riverside Manor incident on Alabama society and Southern plantation culture extended far beyond the specific deaths to create a paranoia about food safety and enslaved cooks that affected every aspect of daily life for slaveholders throughout the region. The realization that cooks and house servants possessed intimate access to food, drink, and the physical spaces where white families were most vulnerable created anxiety that no amount of violence or surveillance could fully address. Plantation owners held emergency meetings to discuss protective measures, but every proposed solution created new problems. Rotating cooks destroyed culinary quality. Having white overseers taste all food proved impractical, and attempting to ban African spiritual practices that were already conducted in secret accomplished nothing except driving them deeper underground. Charleston and Mobile newspapers covered the Riverside Manor incident extensively, though white Southern journalists struggled to frame the story in ways that didn't undermine fundamental assumptions about white supremacy and enslaved people's supposed inferiority. Some accounts emphasized the savagery and primitive evil of voodoo practices to reinforce racist narratives, while others focused on the need for greater vigilance and control over enslaved populations. But regardless of how white media tried to spin the story, the underlying message was inescapable. Enslaved people possessed knowledge and capabilities that slaveholders couldn't fully control, and the intimate nature of domestic service created vulnerabilities that wealth and social position couldn't protect against. The enslaved communities throughout the South heard the story very differently, understanding it as proof that resistance could take forms that white authority couldn't prevent, even when it could punish those who deployed such resistance. The tale of Aunt Josephine and her voodoo feast became part of the oral tradition that connected enslaved people across the region, adapted and embellished with each telling but maintaining its core message, that those who controlled the kitchen controlled life and death. That knowledge dismissed as primitive superstition could destroy those who dismissed it, and that patient systematic resistance could sometimes succeed where immediate rebellion would have been crushed. Harriet Tubman, who conducted rescue missions through Alabama during the late 1850s, reportedly incorporated the Riverside Manor story into her efforts to encourage enslaved people to think creatively about resistance and to recognize that they possessed resources their oppressors couldn't fully comprehend. According to accounts preserved by formerly enslaved people, Tubman had described Josephine as a warrior who had used the weapons available to her rather than accepting that resistance was impossible, and had encouraged others to identify how their particular positions and knowledge might be deployed for justice, even when conventional rebellion seemed futile. The Civil War, which began 7 years after Josephine's execution, was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as the ultimate vindication of the kind of justice she had delivered on an intimate scale. The systematic destruction of a society that had been rotting from within long before military forces arrived to complete its demolition. The parallel between Josephine's curse, transforming the Thornton family's bodies into vehicles of their own destruction, and the war transforming Southern society into the instrument of slavery's end, was noted by numerous observers who saw both as examples of divine justice operating through human agents, who refused to accept that their apparent powerlessness meant they had no capacity to fight back. Ruth, who had witnessed Josephine's work and who had preserved her story, lived to see emancipation in 1865 and spent her remaining years as a recognized practitioner of herbal medicine and spiritual work in Alabama's black community. In interviews, she gave late in life to researchers documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people. She reflected on Josephine's revenge with a perspective that honored both the justice it delivered and the terrible cost it had required. Aunt Josephine taught us that the kitchen is the most powerful room in any house, Ruth explained in an interview conducted in 1897, not because cooks are naturally violent or vengeful, but because food represents the ultimate intimacy and vulnerability. What you eat becomes part of your body, and if someone with the right knowledge wants to put something besides nourishment into that food, there's no way to protect yourself except by treating cooks with the respect and humanity that should be every person's right. The Thorntons and their guests didn't die because Josephine was evil. They died because they spent decades treating as property someone who possessed knowledge that slavery couldn't suppress, and who finally decided that justice required using that knowledge to destroy people who would never face earthly accountability for their crimes. The site where Josephine had been executed became a place of pilgrimage for Alabama's black community, who maintained it as a memorial to a woman who had delivered justice using the only weapons available to her, and who had proven that those who seemed most powerless could sometimes accomplish what conventional resistance could never achieve. A marker was eventually placed at the location bearing an inscription composed by Ruth, Aunt Josephine, 1786-1854, cook, voodoo practitioner, and spiritual warrior who proved that those who control the kitchen control life and death, and who delivered justice through knowledge that slavery could never suppress. Modern historians studying the Riverside Manor incident have documented extensive testimony from formerly enslaved people and their descendants, creating a comprehensive record that challenges conventional assumptions about the forms that resistance to slavery could take and the resources that seemingly powerless people could deploy when circumstances allowed. While some scholars continue to search for natural explanations for the mass deaths, speculating about undetected botulism or other foodborne pathogens, the consistency of testimonies about Josephine's voodoo cursing and the precise fulfillment of her stated intentions have convinced many researchers that something occurred at Riverside Manor that transcended ordinary food poisoning. Dr. Angela Washington, a contemporary professor of African American Studies at the University of Alabama, has written extensively about the Riverside Manor case and its significance for understanding culinary resistance to slavery. Whether one accepts the supernatural explanation or seeks natural causes, the historical impact of Aunt Josephine's story cannot be denied. Dr. Washington argues in her book, Sacred Kitchens, Food, Power, and Resistance in the Antebellum South, the story provided psychological empowerment to thousands of enslaved people who understood that the intimacy of cooking created vulnerabilities that slaveholders couldn't fully control through violence or law. That psychological impact was real and consequential, regardless of the actual mechanism by which 18 people died at a single dinner party in 1854. The legacy of Josephine's voodoo feast extends into contemporary discussions about the hidden dimensions of power in domestic spaces, the vulnerability created by dependence on others for basic sustenance, and the many forms that resistance can take when conventional rebellion is impossible. The story serves as a reminder that those who seem most powerless may possess resources that their oppressors fail to recognize until it's too late, that trust in daily bread can be weaponized by those with knowledge and determination, and that some forms of justice operate through channels that earthly law has no jurisdiction to prevent or control. The descendants of the enslaved community at Riverside Manor, still living in central Alabama today, preserve Josephine's story as part of their family histories and oral traditions. They tell it not to glorify violence or to suggest that poisoning was an appropriate response to slavery's evils, but to honor the memory of a woman who refused to accept that her apparent powerlessness meant she had no capacity to demand justice, who used knowledge that white society dismissed to accomplish what conventional resistance could never have achieved, and who proved that those who control what we eat possess a form of power that transcends any legal ownership or social hierarchy. The incredible story of Aunt Josephine and her devastating voodoo feast challenges us to consider the hidden dimensions of power in every household, to recognize the profound vulnerability we all experience when we trust others with our daily sustenance, and to acknowledge that history is shaped not only by those with obvious power, but also by those who wield knowledge and capabilities that operate through intimacy and daily routine. If this tale of culinary revenge and ultimate justice has moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about the people who prepare what you eat and the trust that act requires, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate these extraordinary stories of resistance that operated through means slaveholders never imagined and couldn't prevent even when they discovered them. Subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage, spiritual power, and the many forms that justice can take when earthly law refuses to act. These are the stories that remind us that the most powerful weapon is sometimes the one no one suspects. The trust in food is the ultimate vulnerability, and that those who cook with both skill and knowledge possess power that transcends any legal status or social hierarchy. Until next time, remember, every meal is an act of trust, and that trust should be earned through treating with dignity and respect the hands that prepare what sustains our lives.